Just coming in moments ago, this one, we don't even have a graphic for it yet, but Maris polls, that suggests that he could actually win this thing by 7 points. So he's a 7-point lead there in Maris, all as he travels the country. Very, very active schedule for Donald Trump. Take a listen to his son.
I mean, think about seven massive rallies in front of 40, 50, 60,000 people. I mean, so these rallies are drawing massive crowds, but 7 rallies in effectively 36 hours. And I think that's the stamina that Americans want, right? I mean, that's the energy that Americans want out of our commander-in-chief. And it's exactly what the current administration doesn't have. It's exactly what Kamala hasn't had this entire campaign trail. And I've never been more proud of that man right there. I mean, the guy is working tirelessly. The guy just never stops, and he wants to save this country. He wants to save the greatest nation on earth.
Wow. So he's working tirelessly, to Eric Trump's point. 7 rallies in 36 hours compared with Kamala Harris doing 2. I mean, 2? It's been kind of going on the entire time, has it not? I mean, you felt like he's just this machine who just keeps getting up and going, even when faced with the threat of losing his life. And so now, as we come upon the 11th hour, I want to show you, yes, the New York Times has him effectively dead even with Kamala Harris. Dead even. I think it's going to come down to Pennsylvania. Polymarket, on the other hand, look at this. So we had started to see some crossover last night. And then what did he do? He rallied again. He rallied again in the Polymarket forecast. Polymarket being a betting site where people from all over the world are putting down money on this. Now, actually, unfortunately, as an American, you can't do so because of certain restrictions on these betting market sites. But this is a rather big deal. Okay, so again, Polymarket showing a 59% chance of Donald Trump winning this thing. So, wow. All right. And it's all going to come down. It's going to come down to one state, in my estimation. That state is Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania is going to make or break the country at this point. I want to play for you some sound from the Atlas Intel CEO. Now, Atlas Intel is a poll that has been rather recent, but quite right. So they got 2020 right. And so people are thinking about what they're saying with some level of seriousness. There's a gravity there to it. Take a listen to the CEO there of Atlas Intel talking about why it is so critical right now that Donald Trump double down on his base. A lot of people said, go wide, go wide, go wide. And he's like, when you look at him in the final hour, he really seems to be trying to get a message out to the base, the garbage truck and the whole thing, because it is that male-centric base that could actually make or break him specifically in Pennsylvania. There have been some rumblings, some concerns that you haven't seen enough men at the early voting booths. So will they show up on election day? Will they be motivated? Listen to this guy.
What really makes a difference in the swing states, what will really make a difference on Tuesday, in my opinion, in a place like Pennsylvania, will Puerto Ricans there be important? Of course. But even more so, it will be the white turnout mobilization. So, if white males really turn out for Trump on Tuesday, he can carry out Pennsylvania. And I think, the whole garbage truck scene and whatever we're seeing in terms of efforts to mobilize voters in this phase of the campaign, it kind of makes sense. From a strategic perspective, this is what he needs. He needs to mobilize voters on election day in the Rust Belt states. This is what will make the difference between him winning or losing this presidential election.
Really amazing, right? That it's going to come down to that. And so perhaps some of his instincts were right in terms of doubling down on specifically that base. You think about the Teamsters poll. I think that says a lot when 70% of the people polled there in the Teamsters union are going to vote for Donald Trump, despite all of the things that they've been told by their union bosses and the media, etc. I do want to go briefly to this Iowa poll and dissect it a little bit, because there was a poll out over the weekend. It came out Friday night by Ann Seltzer, who's a reputable pollster. And it's just kind of this outlier. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And we can explain why it doesn't make a whole lot of sense, but also why it is super critical super duper critical that we see that male contingency, that sort of base, the white male base that they're talking about there at Atlas Polling coming out for him in Pennsylvania. Before that, just a reminder that we are sponsored in part by our friends over at American Hartford Gold. You know, I'm a big fan of gold and investing in gold. I see it as one of those ways to help diversify your portfolio. You can get up to $15,000 worth of free silver right now from these folks if you call them at 1-844-495-1115, or you can go to this URL. You can't forget it. TrishLovesGold.com. Trish Loves Gold. You can also text them and you'll get more information this way about that special offer for my viewers. Text Trish, my name, to 65532. Again, text Trish to 65532. But I want to turn at this moment to what we saw out of Iowa, guys. Look at this. And you're like, oopsie daisy. That is North Carolina. So that is actually not, no, it is Iowa. Forgive me. So that's just mislabeled. Anyway, North Carolina was a good poll. This one for Trump is suggesting that he's not going to win this. This is a poll on Iowa, 44% to 47%. And you're like, what is that about? I mean, how could that be? Well, there was this poll that came out over the weekend, as I said, 44 to 47. And people are like, It's interesting because you also had another poll from Emerson College, Emerson coming out, and they've been accused of doing things like hurting their numbers. Nate Silver, who is a statistician, has talked about this a lot. He doesn't actually see some of these polls like Emerson as being great because they throw out the outliers. Well, this was an outlier. So Emerson has him up 9, but why would Ann, who has this good reputation, not maybe look a little bit more in depth in this? Because it's really kind of bonkers. It doesn't gel with anything that we've seen nationally. It doesn't gel with anything that we've even seen from other pollsters coming out of Iowa. Iowa, actually, he's still up, according to Nate, 48.8% overall versus 45.4%. That seems to make a little bit more sense. Anyway, Ann sat down with Mark Halpern and tried to explain this away. I want you to hear it, and we will discuss.
Your poll is showing a different kind of result, different than other public polls of Iowa, and again, different in the crosstabs from other polls. It's given that it's a state Donald Trump won by 8 last time. It is an outlier in that respect. How would you explain what would account for that?
So what accounts for that, and we saw this in our September poll very clearly, our June poll when Joe Biden was on the ticket, Donald Trump had an 18-point advantage. That dropped to a 4-point advantage. So the margin was narrowed by 14 points. And somebody asked me, well, did Donald Trump lose ground? Is that what you're saying? I go, okay, that's a very interesting question. And I got out my calculator and figured out that, in fact, we had 88 more respondents in our likely voter pool. Those are weighted respondents for the geeks in the crowd. And Donald Trump had 3 more than he had in June. So he didn't lose ground. It's that we had more people who qualified as a likely voter in September, and 85 of those weighted bodies went for Kamala Harris. So that's a pretty dynamic change.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really dynamic change. You got to ask, why is it that all of a sudden your voting population has changed so drastically? I mean, did you have a huge inswell of people into Iowa? I mean, what's going on with the demographics in your poll? How could they be that different from, say, June or what you had a couple months earlier? So she talked about this, the demographics of those who are qualified to vote in the state of Iowa right now. Listen.
Change. The demographics we could see separately of the people who qualified compared to June: women, college educated, younger people, all demographics that were more likely than average to support Kamala Harris. So that's how I explain that, and it's really pretty much the same thing here.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay, so she's saying that women, college educated, they're the ones that are changing the name of the game. This would actually gel with what you just heard from Atlas, the CEO of Atlas Intel, because he's saying, listen, what it's going to come down to is whether or not you see men showing up at the polling boost on Tuesday. If men show up in droves, then Donald Trump is going to win this thing. And that's why you see him doubling down on the base right now. But Anne is making the point that all these other women are coming into it. So I'm like, okay, young women, educated women. Well, then she kind of threw me for a curveball because she's talking to Mark and somehow then says it's really senior women. So just listen to this one for a second.
So what people are skeptical about is they say the sample you came up with in all these areas just is too large a shift that's not reflected in other state polling.
Yeah.
Towards
Okay.
Harris. And so again, you would say that your record suggests that when you do poll with your methodology, you get a good reflection of the electorate. And if these changes occurred, it means these changes occurred from one cycle to another, right?
Yes, I have been looking at seniors all the way through this cycle because they have historically been more likely to vote for the Republican candidate. So I've had my eye on them this whole time. Well, here, so that's a big number, it's saying, for senior women voting for a Democrat, if that's what that means. It is showing up in my data. It
Right.
is showing up that that's the biggest margin Kamala Harris has.
Right. So
And especially because seniors didn't necessarily vote for Democrats in the past.
Right. So last question is, as a polling expert.
So that's interesting. Senior women, she says, are the ones that are coming out for Kamala. I mean, it kind of contradicts what she said earlier, does it not, when she mentioned the young women were coming out for Kamala? Let's just go with this. Lots of women are coming out for Kamala. But what's interesting about the data point is if you have that much in the way of senior women, are these the new voting groups coming out? And why isn't this reflected in any other poll that we have seen? I mean, New York Times Siena poll showing us that they're kind of neck and neck, right? So very different than, for example, what you're seeing from Ann Seltzer there. So I suspect that this is an outlier. And I'm not the only one. Nate Silver, who I trust because he's got a really good model and he's a really good sort of gauge of all of these polls and which ones matter, and he weights them differently. He's making the point that while she's a really good pollster, she may just be really off on this one, like really, really off. Because again, this is mislabeled. It's not North Carolina. It is Iowa. It is Iowa. 44 to 47 just really and truly doesn't make a ton of sense. So I do say this, however, you know what? Everybody's got to be motivated. Everybody's got to stay focused. And if you have a friend who maybe is thinking of not going and voting, you need to remind that friend, it is time to get yourself to the polls because it's going to be that tight. And we don't want it to be tight, right? We don't want it to be tight. We want it to be so much of a groundswell of support for change because I don't know how much more we can take of the status quo. I don't know how much more people can take in terms of inflation. She's out there today actually saying, oh, no, it's business's fault. It's the grocery store's fault. Lady, it's not, okay? They have razor thin margins. My colleague over at 76 Research, Rob Horton and I, we've actually done a fair amount of research on this, and we published a note earlier on it. As soon as this started coming up saying, hey, you know, this makes no sense. By the way, little shout out for 76. You can see our portfolio has done extremely well. Median stock up 10.8%. For the last quarter, S&P index at that time was up only 5.9%. So really good. You see some huge wins there in terms of consumers, financial picks, utilities pick up 25%, 24%. Go to 76research.com. If nothing else, just sign up and get at least the free stuff. I would recommend taking a look at the model portfolios there. You can get all of the portfolios plus any future portfolios. We're working on one right now that come out, and that would be by getting what's known as the Founders Club. So if you get the Founders Club, you're going to get the whole kit and caboodle. So I do recommend that, guys. I really do. This I created for you. You know, we don't get money based on what stocks you go in or anything. That's not how the business model works. The business model works by a lot of people subscribing to this, and that's why we make it so cheap, because it's a volume thing. It's great research, obviously, as you can see, because when you can beat the S&P, that's the goal, right? You want to be able, with your research, to really have some wins. That's the goal. But Rob and I have reported on this at 76research.com. go there. And what we found is that the margins are so darn thin. It's not grocery stores trying to gouge consumers, as she would try and tell you. It's the fact that we printed so much darn money that she signed the Inflation Reduction Act that actually caused trillions more to come into this economy, that you had Jerome Powell at the time at the Federal Reserve printing more money, that you had the third stimmy check that went out. That's what led to all this inflation. You had too many dollars chasing too few goods. And look, I mean, it's just the reality of where we are. You can't do that and expect that you're going to have 2% inflation. I don't know what they were thinking. I was telling them, you're not going to have it. You're not going to have it. But they have rocks in their head or something. I don't know. Or just the reality is they want all the money to be going to government. They want government to control things. So they want to be dishing it out. And that's a problem. Again, shout out for our friends at American Heart for Gold, because that's one of the reasons I like gold, right? You get it. You get it. In other words, you have too many dollars. So what's backing this stuff up? It's why you've seen gold prices in part. There's also the international climate, but that's partly why gold has moved up. Go to trishlovesgold.com or text Trish to 65532 today. You can learn more about how you're going to get $15,000, up to $15,000 for qualifying offers in free silver, again, at American Heart for Gold. Their number is 1-844-495-1115. But this election is coming down so much to the economy, and it's coming down to men to see whether or not they come out and they vote in droves for Donald Trump.